Hello and welcome to the Sound of Science, the place where we deconstruct unscientific reasoning. Please consider to like and subscribe if you support science. Thanks for watching. Today I want to analyze another episode of the Atheist Experience. This time it concerns a call from Scott, who is from Seattle.
Well, a friend of mine, a very close family friend actually, encouraged me to call you, so I'm not going to give his name just to keep him out of the limelight at this moment. But, he said I should call you, so I took him up on the request.
Yeah, nothing serious going on here yet. But when Scott starts off with telling that friends asked him to call, that's the first yellow flag. Because with this explanation, Scott kind of makes himself important. What he basically says is that his friends think that Scott would be capable of making some good points in the show, unless his friends, of course, want Scott to call Matt and John to learn some critical thinking. But somehow I don't think that is what Scott wants to tell us.
Yes, so I'll try to be as brief as I can as to how I became a theist. Is that fair?
Sure.
As you can see, Matt and John, at this stage, want to give Scott a chance to tell his story. But I'm raising a second yellow flag here. I've seen hundreds of these shows, and the stories about how people became Christians basically only come in two flavors. The first one is the real story, and that is, I was born in a Christian family. I went to a Christian school and I visited church every week. And when you're a child, you basically believe all the stuff that grown-ups tell you. But that is not the kind of story that theists who call this show want to tell. The other flavor often is that theists tell you that they have converted from atheist to theist in a natural way. I've heard so many of these stories, and very often they just don't seem to be very plausible and look much more like some kind of religious propaganda. But let's see what Scott has got to tell us.
I was pretty much raised in a non-religious household. We had Christmas, but Christmas was Santa Claus, and we had Easter, and Easter was, the Easter Bunny. I noticed that it seemed to me, no one really needed to make an argument, it just seemed to me intuitively that this place we call Earth wasn't an accident. And while at age 7, 8, 9 years old, it wasn't like I felt compelled to talk to anybody about that perception. I just figured everybody else around me observed the same and evidence, if you will, and made the same conclusion from it.
Although Matt and John apparently let Scott continue to tell his story, I'm going to raise a first red flag here. Scott wants us to believe here that he, as an 8 to 9-year-old kid coming from a non-religious family, thought about the world not being an accident. I don't believe that. That is not how 8 to 9-year-old boys from a non-religious household view the world. The world not being an accident, whatever that may be, is apologetics language. It's not children's language. Especially Scott's explanation that he didn't talk about it because he thought that everyone else would think the same thing. That doesn't make any sense at all. If you grow up in a non-religious family, you know that your family does not look at the world that way. And the second red flag comes for the remark that Scott, being an 8 to 9-year-old boy, thought that people around him would observe the same evidence as he did. Again, that is not how an 8 to 9-year-old boy from a non-religious family would think. And of course, what evidence? And evidence for what? So we're only 1 minute into the call and Scott already is attempting to give his remarks some more gravity by smuggling in the word evidence, without explaining what kind of evidence and what it proves in the first place. Note how Scott raises his voice when he says the word evidence.
I just figured everybody else around me observed the same and evidence, if you will.
That looks like some trick to give the word more importance, while it has no meaning whatsoever in the context that he is using it.
fast forward to being in junior high and high school, and while still pretty much non-religious, I found myself leaning to the fact that somebody made this. This wasn't an accident. I just looked at everything around me and said, this was put together by somebody who must love people and must love me.
Another huge red flag here. I'm now convinced Scott is giving us the usual cheap religious propaganda speech here. He describes himself as not being religious in high school, yet he thinks the world was made by someone. If you think the world is made by someone, you are, of course, religious. Scott applies even more language tricks to make it sound as if he is telling credible things by using the word fact. He says, I found myself leaning to the fact that somebody made this. This wasn't an accident. No, there is no fact to mention whatsoever. You just thought of something, and only if you can provide sufficient evidence that supports your claims. Only then we might be able to determine some facts. And by just mentioning the words evidence and fact, you don't magically create evidence and facts. By now, of course, I don't trust Scott anymore. With every sentence that leaves his mouth, his call is becoming more suspicious. The standard, I was born in a non-religious family, yet I became a Christian. The smuggling in of the words evidence and fact without providing any. The slow and lengthy description of how he became a Christian without explaining any reasons as to why he made his choices, so that he won't be interrupted by people who want to refute his reasons. It all very much looks like consistently working from a propaganda script. And that usually means that people who operate like this are not interested in any exchange of ideas. People who are working from these scripts just want to have as much as possible uninterrupted airtime to preach. I'm not telling that that is what Scott is doing, but it does look like that is what is going on.
Do you think that's a good way to get to the truth? To look around and say, I just kind of feel like this is the case? You didn't have evidence of somebody actually making the world. You just decided that that's kind of the way it is.
And now, of course, Matt thinks this theist propaganda has gone far enough. So Matt addresses Scott's motivation to believe things, because Scott has had the opportunity now for a couple of minutes to tell us something substantial. But all he did was telling that without any good reason, he started to think there was a God. So of course Matt is going to apply a bit of pressure here, but I think we can see he is still very patient.
Well, no, I had evidence of, even though I'll admit I haven't visited personally any of the other planets, I had, pictures from the moon and going, wow, those places look hot or cold or lonely.
So now that Matt is asking Scott for some evidence that led him to believe in his God, Scott has to take a side street in his script, and then we immediately see that he has got nothing new or original to offer. Scott falls back on the totally worn out "the universe was tailor-made for us" non-argument that has no meaning whatsoever. If there are two objects or phenomena that seem to fit rather well, that doesn't mean that they were designed to fit each other. It's like a potato that thinks, wow, the shape of the soil that surrounds me is perfectly designed to fit my shape. It's a perfect match. I mean, that can't be an accident. If my shape would have been just slightly different, or if the shape of the soil would have been slightly different, I wouldn't have been able to fit into this soil, so then I wouldn't have existed. Isn't it a miracle? There just must be an uncaused creating genius magic man. I usually try to refrain from being rude, but people who believe that the tailor-made universe argument is a credible explanation for anything surely must have limited intellectual capacities.
I don't understand what that has to do with how you went about reaching a conclusion that the earth was specifically created for you. Because Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you think God created all those other things too?
As a kid, I really didn't contemplate that.
Now, that one is not credible at all, because Scott just told us that when he was in high school, he contemplated about the world being created by someone, and to be more specific, someone who loves us. According to his own explanation, Scott was already a theist in high school, so it's not very credible to dodge Matt's question by now saying that he didn't contemplate if God also made all the other extremely inhospitable places in the universe.
My foundation of faith was more from observation and sort of rudimentary science. I didn't run any experiments.
So Scott already smuggled in the word evidence without showing any evidence or explaining what it is that his evidence proves. And then he smuggled in the word fact, and now he's smuggling in the words faith, observation, and science, all in one sentence as if they are somehow connected. Up to now, Scott hasn't shown any good reason to believe in a God, and he did not provide any data that could support the existence of a God. All Scott is doing is smuggling in some science-related words to make his belief more credible. It's a very old and very silly trick, and I think it wouldn't have been rude for Matt and John to call him out on that.
I am saying that in my growing up as a youth and then as a young man, I went through normal questioning and evaluating of where do I come from and why am I here.
Sure.
No, not sure. Non-religious boys from 8 to 9 years old do not typically ask themselves, why am I here? That is the kind of question that is asked by people with a religious background. If you're non-religious, you don't think there is a why in cosmic existence. That is part of a theist mindset. Non-believers think in what and how questions.
But I finally said, okay, God, you know I've been with you all these years, not in a religious way, but just, when I had a fight with my girlfriend, I would talk to you. I would praise you and sing songs to you as I was, walking on a beach or something and say, wow, God, the moon is really pretty. That was my religion, me and God, okay? Nothing formal.
This is so hilarious. Scott is still in the process here of trying to pretend how he slowly and naturally evolved from being non-religious to becoming a Christian, while he already was a Christian. But he is so much absorbed by his own religion, and probably from a very young age, that he simply doesn't see that what he describes as being non-religious is in fact totally devoted and utterly indoctrinated theism. This is such a fail, and it's pretty remarkable that Matt and John don't pull the plug on this one.
And then I go, but God, all these people on my college campus keep telling me about Jesus. And I don't know that, I suppose he's a historical figure, but is he really your son? Is he really someone who died on the cross and on purpose was sent here to do that for us?
This is so funny. A theist trying to pose as a critical thinker. Without any good reason, he starts believing in the existence of a God, and that unjustified belief expands as he grows older. And then the critical thinking he does consists of, is this Jesus dude real? And of course we know how this is going to end. Jesus heals him. And how does he know? He just knows. And if we don't believe him, we are materialistic, communists, Satanists, sinners. Probably something like that.
And so I said, okay, God, I want you to heal me from this sickness. And so I went in for my monthly white count test, and the doctor said, well, it's still bad news. Well, the next day, the woman in charge of the lab called me and said, you're better.
This is how many theists believe that they can prove the existence of their God. Just claim that you prayed to God to be healed, and the next day you were no longer ill. But a story like that proves diddly squat, nothing, nada. It's an unverifiable story that anyone could make up in order to prove anything. I prayed to Gandalf and Frodo and asked them to help me to get out of this financial misery. And then the next day, I was offered a job. So that proves that Gandalf and Frodo exist? Because I told a story? No, of course not. All these I prayed and then I got cured stories are meaningless nonsense. And the effect of praying has been put to the test in proper scientific experiments numerous times. And the fact is, praying doesn't help you to accomplish anything. About every scientific study into the effect of praying shows there isn't any effect, unless you tell people you're praying for them, and then the effect is negative.
If you say you're aware that illnesses go into remission, and your illness went into remission, how did you determine what the cause of that remission was?
How
did you determine that it was the prayer?
The blood, I'm telling you, the blood, a woman called...
The blood is irrelevant. The blood is... Scott. The blood... No, Scott. Yes, no, you hang on. You hang on, Scott. The blood... Scott, for Christ's sake, I put you on hold.
Now, this is the point where Matt really wants to get to the core of the matter. This theist has had a significant portion of time to display his religious propaganda script that doesn't prove or demonstrate anything. But this is the point where he finally unfolds his so-called evidence that led him to believe in a God. And that is, he had some illness, and then he prayed to God, and soon afterwards he was healed. And for the sake of the argument, Matt is even prepared to believe that, without Scott giving any evidence to show this really happened. But even then, we're left with the core of the matter. Remission of illness can happen for various reasons. So Matt is asking Scott now, how did you determine that it was God who took away your illness? And what happens then is astonishing and shows the apparent unwillingness of Scott to admit that the justification for his belief is less than paper thin.
The blood is irrelevant. I will accept that your blood improved. I'm asking, how did you determine that the cause of the remission was your prayer to Jesus?
Look, the cause of the are you still there?
Yes.
The cause of the remission was because I prayed. And even
I'm asking, how did you determine that that was the cause?
Because the blood test, the white cell count.
What we're really talking about is what was the cause of the change in the white count? And you're saying it's the prayer. And I'm saying, how do you know it's the prayer?
That's exactly right.
How do you know it's the prayer?
Like I said before I gave you this.
Like you said, nothing. We're done.
And that's it. Matt hangs up and he's completely right. Because yes, Scott is applying a system of circular reasoning here. And this time it's so blatantly ridiculous that you really wonder how this man even ended up in this show. His friends said he should call. Why? When it comes to really showing the reasons why he believes something, Scott has got nothing to offer. He says he was ill, then he prayed, and then he got cured. So Matt is asking him, how do you know what was the cause of your cure? And Scott says, because I prayed. And then Matt asks, how do you know? And then Scott says, because I was cured. And then Matt again asks, but how do you know? What was the cause of your cure? And then Scott says, because I prayed. Scott really goes full circle here, repeatedly. And it very much resembles how many theists pretend to explain why we should believe that the Bible is true. How do we know the Bible is true? Because God says so. How do we know? Because it's in the Bible. Anyone who applies this kind of circular reasoning is kind of insulting his debating opponents. With this kind of circular reasoning, I can prove the existence of Donald Duck. How do I know that Donald Duck exists? Because it's in his magazine. How do I know the magazine is true? Because it's the word of Donald Duck. How do I know that? Because the magazine says so. Because of the way this call ends, I'm still not entirely sure if Scott is genuinely deluded about what logical reasoning is, or if he is a propagandist who was just claiming as much airtime as possible to preach his script. But because of all the textbook propaganda clues in his wordings, I would lean to the latter. And let me summarize those clues again for you so that you might recognize them next time if you hear a theist explain his or her reasons to believe in a God. So the first clue that we've been listening to a propagandist preaching his religious message is that Scott claims that his friends told him to call. You see, this is completely irrelevant. It makes me feel that he is portraying some self-importance even before he has demonstrated anything. Second clue is that Scott claims he grew up in a non-religious family, and he emphasizes this throughout his story. Why? It is irrelevant for the reasons one could have to believe in a God. The only function this storyline seems to have is to suggest that believing in a God is somehow a natural thing. Third clue is that in his entire story, Scott never gives us one good reason why he believes in a God. While that basically was the promise of his call, Scott only uses precious airtime to describe a lengthy process of then I did this and then I thought that. Stuff like that is also completely irrelevant to the existence of a God. Again, this also looks like Scott is trying to convey the message that believing in a God is somehow a natural process. Fourth clue is that Scott uses suspicious wordings by hijacking terms such as evidence, observation, and science. He inserts these words into his story without these words having any meaning in the context of the story. He even raises his voice when he mentions the word evidence. And he also uses the word faith in the same sentence. It very much looks like he is trying to give the word faith the same kind of gravity as these scientific phrases. Again, it proves or demonstrates nothing regarding the existence of a God. And then finally, when Scott's main premise, and that is my illness disappeared because of praying, when that premise is put to the test, Scott frustrates the debate with circular reasoning. Again, that is so typical for preaching from a script during these kind of call-in shows. I've seen this hundreds of times, and it gives the caller even more airtime to convey a theist position without proving or demonstrating anything. So I'd say a big thumbs down for Scott here. And the only reason why he's not wasting our time is because he gives us a pretty clear insight in the tricks that some theists apply to push their agenda and to keep us believing in gods without providing any good reason for it. I hope this explanation was of any help. Thanks for watching.